This happy death of the patriarch St. Joachim happened, as I said, about a year and a half after his most holy daughter Mary had entered the temple. Hence she was 3.5 years old, when she was left without an earthly father. The age of the patriarch was 69 years, divided as follows. At the age of 46 he accepted St. Anne as his spouse. In the 20th year of his marriage they were blessed with Most Holy Mary, and the 3.5 years of the age of her age at his death complete the 69.5 years, a few days more or less. After the death of the Holy Patriarch and father of our Queen, the angels of her guard at once returned to the presence of Mary and related to her what had happened in the passing away of her father. And immediately the most prudent child turned in solicitous prayers to the Lord, asking him to console, govern, and assist her mother Anne with fatherly kindness in her solicitude after the death of her husband. Saint Anne also sent notice of the death of Joachim to the instructress of the heavenly princess, asking her to console the child and breaking the news to her. The teacher acted accordingly, and the most wise child listened to her thankfully, concealing her own knowledge. However, it was with the patience and modesty of a queen, and of one who was not oblivious of the possibility of the event which her instructress related to her as new. Acting in all things according to the highest perfection, she betook herself at once into the temple, reiterating her sacrifice of praise, humility, patience, and of other virtues, and progressing always with more accelerated and beautiful steps in the eyes of the Most High. Canticles 7:1. As a climax of these exercises, she, as usual, requested the holy angels to concur and assist in blessing God. Instruction which the Queen of Heaven gave me. My daughter, renovate many times in the secret of thy heart thy esteem for the blessing of tribulations, which the hidden providence of God dispenses for the justification of mortals. These are the judgments justified in themselves, Psalm 18:10-11, and more valuable than precious stones and gold, more sweet than the honeycomb, to those who know how to hold them in proper esteem. I wish thee to remember, my beloved, that to suffer and to be afflicted, with or without one's fault, is a benefit of which one cannot be worthy without special and great mercy of the Almighty. Moreover, to be allowed to suffer for one's sins is not only a mercy, but is demanded by justice. Behold, however, the great insanity of the children of Adam nowadays in desiring and seeking after emoluments, benefits, and favors agreeable to their senses, in sleeplessly striving to avert from themselves that which is painful or increases any hardship or trouble. It would be to their greatest benefit to seek tribulations diligently, even when unmerited, yet they strive by all means to avoid them, even when merited, and even though they cannot be happy and blessed without having undergone such sufferings. When gold is untouched by the furnace heat, the iron by the file, the grain by the grinding stone or flail, the grapes by the winepress, they are all useless and will not attain the end for which they are created. Why then will mortals continue to deceive themselves by expecting, in spite of their sins, to become pure and worthy of enjoying God without the furnace or the file of sorrows? If they were incapable and unworthy of attaining to the crown and reward of the infinite and eternal good when innocent, how can they attain it when they are in darkness and in disgrace before the Almighty? In addition to this, the sons of perdition are exerting all the powers to remain unworthy and hostile to God, and in evading crosses and afflictions, which are the paths left open for returning to God, in rejecting the light of the intellect, which is the means of recognizing the deceptiveness of visible things, in refusing the nourishment of the just, which is the only means of grace, the price of glory, and above all in repudiating the legitimate inheritance selected by my Son and Lord for himself and for all his elect, since he was born and lived continually in afflictions and died upon the cross. By such standards, my daughter, must thou measure the value of suffering, which the worldly will not understand, since they are unworthy of heavenly knowledge. They despise it in proportion to their ignorance. Rejoice and congratulate thyself in thy sufferings, and whenever the Almighty deigns to send thee any, hasten to meet it and welcome it as one of his blessings and pledges of his glorious love. Furnish thy heart with magnanimity and constancy, so that when occasion of suffering is given thee, thou mayest bear it with the same equanimity as the prosperous and agreeable things. Be not filled with sadness in executing that which thou hast promised in gladness, for the Lord loves those that are equally ready to give as to receive. Sacrifice thy heart and all thy faculties as a holocaust of patience, and chant in new hymns of praise and joy the justification of the Most High, whenever in the place of thy peregrination, he signalizes and distinguishes thee as his own, with the signs of his friendship, which are no other than the tribulations and trials of suffering. Take notice, my dearest, that my most holy Son and myself are trying to find among those who have arrived at the way of the cross some soul whom we can instruct systematically in this divine science, and whom we can withdraw from the worldly and diabolical wisdom in which the sons of Adam, with blind stubbornness, are rejecting the salutary discipline of sufferings. If thou wishest to be our disciple, enter into this school, in which alone is taught the doctrine of the cross and the manner of reaching true peace and veritable delights. With this wisdom, the earthly love of sensible pleasures and riches is not compatible, nor the vain ostentation and pomp which fascinates the blear-eyed worldlings, who are so covetous of passing honors, and so full of ignorant admiration for costly grandeur. Thou, my daughter, choose for thyself the better part of being among the lowly and the forgotten ones of this world. I was mother of the God-man himself, and, on that account, mistress of all creation conjointly with my son. Yet I was little known, and my son very much despised by men. If this doctrine were not most valuable and secure, we would not have taught it by word and example. This is the light which shines in the darkness. John 1:7. Loved by the elect and abhorred by the reprobate. The Princess of Heaven begins to suffer affliction. God absents himself from Most Holy Mary, her sweet and amorous sighs. The Most High, who is in his infinite wisdom, dispenses and regulates the welfare of his beloved ones according to weight and measure, resolved to exercise our heavenly princess with some afflictions adapted to her age and state of childhood. Though she was always great in grace, he wished by this means to increase her glory. For entirely filled with the grace and wisdom was our child Mary. Nevertheless, it was befitting that she should learn by experience, and thus make advancement and understand better the science of suffering, which only experience can bring to its ultimate perfection and thoroughness. During the brief course of her tender years, she had enjoyed the delights of the Most High and his caresses, and of the angels and of her parents, and in the temple the tender love of her teachers and of the priests, because in the eyes of all of them she was most gracious and amiable. It was now time that she should commence to know all the good she possessed in another light and by another knowledge, namely, the one which is acquired by the absence and privation of the good, and that she make use of it for the practice of those virtues which arise from comparison between the state of favors and caresses with the state of dereliction, aridity, and tribulation. The first affliction which our princess suffered was that the Lord suspended the continual visions which he had so far vouchsafed to her. So much the greater was the sorrow occasioned her thereby, in proportion as it was an unaccustomed experience, in proportion as the treasure thus withdrawn was high and precious. Also the holy angels concealed themselves from her, and at the withdrawal from her sight of so many, so excellent and so heavenly beings, which took place all at once, although they did not cease to surround her invisibly for her protection, that most pure soul seemed to herself entirely forsaken and left alone in the dark night occasioned by the absence of her beloved. It was a great surprise to our little queen, for the Lord, though he had in general prepared her for the coming of tribulations, had not specified their nature, and as the innocent heart of the most simple dove harbored no thoughts and entertained no practical conclusions except such as were conformable to her humility and incomparable love, she explained all according to this same light. In her humility she began to think that she had not merited the further presence and possession of the lost good on account of her ingratitude, and in her inflamed love she sighed and yearned after it with such great and loving affection and sorrow that there were no words to express them. She turned with her whole soul to the Lord in this new state, and said to him, quote, Highest God and Lord of all creation, infinite in bounty and riches and rich in mercies, I confess, my Lord, that such a vile creature cannot merit thy favors, and my soul, in utmost sorrow, reproaches itself with its own ingratitude and with the loss of thy friendship. If my ingratitude has eclipsed the sun which vivified, animated, and illumined me, and if I have been remiss in giving thanks for the great benefits I acknowledge, my Lord and Shepherd, the sin of my great negligence. If, like an ignorant and simple little sheep, I did not know how to be thankful and do what is most acceptable in thy eyes, see me prostrate on the earth, adhering to the dust, in order to be raised from my poverty and destitution by thee, my God, who dwellest on high. Thy powerful hands have formed me, Job 10:8, and thou canst not be ignorant of our composition, Psalm 102:14. And in what kind of a vase thou hast placed thy treasures. My soul wastes away in bitterness, Psalm 30:11, and in thy absence, since thou art its sweetest life, only thou canst restore its drooping life. To whom shall I go in thy absence? Whither shall I turn my eyes without having light to direct them? Who shall console me when all is affliction? Who shall preserve me from death, and when there is no life left? She also turned toward the angels and continued without ceasing in her loving complaint, saying to them, quote, Celestial princes, ambassadors of the great and highest King, and most faithful friends of my soul, why have you also left me? Why do you also deprive me of your sweet countenances and deny me your intercourse? But I do not wonder, my lords, at your displeasure, if through my unthankfulness I have merited to fall into the disgrace of your and my Creator. Lights of the heavens, enlighten me in my ignorance in this matter. And if I have been at fault, correct me, and obtain again for me the pardon of my Lord. Most noble courtiers of the celestial Jerusalem, have pity on my sorrow and dereliction. Tell me, where is my beloved? Tell me where he has hidden himself. Canticles 3:3. Tell me where I can find him without wandering about. Canticles 1:6. And without going through the gatherings of all the creatures. But woe to me, for you do not answer, though you are so courteous and well know the hiding place of my spouse, since he never withdraws his face in beauty from your sight. Unquote. Thereupon she turned toward all the rest of creation, and in continual anxieties of her love she spoke to them and said, quote, Without doubt, you also, being thankful and being armed against all the ungrateful, are exasperated against her who was ungrateful. But even by the goodness of the Lord, you permit me to remain in your midst. Although I am so vile, you cannot thereby satisfy my longings. Very beautiful and extensive are ye, O heavens, beautiful and refulgent are the planets and all the stars. Great and mighty are the elements. The earth is adorned and clothed in the perfumed plants and herbs. Innumerable are the fishes of the waters. Admirable are the elevations of the sea. Psalm 92:4. Swift are the birds in their feathery weight. Hidden are the minerals, courageous are the animals in their strength, and all of these together serve as a gradual ascent and in a sweet harmony. Teach the way to my beloved, yet they are but circuitous paths for one that loves him, and if I course swiftly over them, I find myself at the end absent from my blessedness. For with the measured approach of these creatures to his unmeasurable bounty, my flight is not content, my sorrow is not allayed, my pains are unrivaled, unrelieved. My anguish increases. My desires are augmented. My heart is more inflamed and faints away in the unsatiating love of mere earthly things. O sweet death in the absence of my life. O sorrowful life in the absence of my very soul and of my beloved. What shall I do? Whither shall I turn? How can I live? Yet how can I die, since my life is wanting? What force sustains me? O all you creatures, that with your ever-renewed existence and perfections give me such tokens of my Lord, attend and see whether there is a sorrow like unto my sorrow. Unquote. Our Heavenly Lady indulged her sorrow in many other discourses, expressing them in spoken words, such as cannot be conceived by other created understanding. For she alone possessed the wisdom and love properly to estimate the meaning of the absence of God in a soul, since she alone had known and enjoyed his presence in its highest beatitude. But if even the angels, in a holy and loving emulation, were filled with admiration to see a mere creature and so tender a child exercising such a variety of acts of the most prudent humility, of faith, of love, of affection, and such flights of a loving heart, who can ever explain the pleasure and delight which the Lord himself took in the soul of the chosen one, and in its aspirations, of which each one wounded the heart of his majesty, and which proceeded from a greater and more loving graciousness than he had given to the seraphim. And if they all together, being in the continual presence of the divinity, could not exercise or imitate the example given by the most holy Mary, nor fulfill the laws of love so perfectly as she in the absence and concealment of her God, what was the complacency of the most holy Trinity in this creature? This is a mystery hidden to our littleness, but it is meet that we worship it in wonder and admire it in all reverence. Our most innocent dove found no peace for her heart, nor any footrest for her affections. Genesis 8:9. While thus with incessant sighing she took her flight through all the range of creation and beyond. Many times she sought to approach the Lord in tears and loving complaints. She turned to the angels of her guard and addressed all the creatures as if they were capable of reason. Then she would ascend to the highest habitation by her penetrating intellect and her most ardent affections, where the highest good had met her, and where she reciprocally with it had enjoyed ineffable delights. But the Most High Lord, her beloved spouse, who allowed her to possess and yet not enjoy him as before, inflamed by this possession of him only more and more her most pure heart, increasing her merits, and showering upon her continually new, though hidden gifts, in order that, in possessing them the more, she might love the better, and being more loved and possessed, she seek him with ever greater anxiousness and contrivances of her fiery love. Quote, I seek him, unquote, said the heavenly princess. Quote, and I do not find him. Canticles 2:2. Again I was awakened, and running through the streets and squares of the city of God, I renewed my anxieties, but alas for me, that my hands distilled the myrrh. Canticles 5:5. My diligence is of no avail. My exertions serve only to increase my sorrow. Canticles 6:7. My beloved absents himself. I call him, and he does not answer me. I turn my eyes to seek him, but the guards and the sentinels of the city and all creatures were an annoyance to me and offended my sight. Daughters of Jerusalem, holy and just souls, you I beseech, you I supplicate, if you meet my beloved, tell him that I am faint and that I am dying with love. Unquote. In these sweet and loving lamentations our queen continued for several days, like the humble spikenard, giving forth most fragrant odors of sweetness. But the Lord remained unmoved by her anxieties and secreted himself in the hidden recesses of her most faithful heart. The divine providence, for its greater glory and for the superabundant merit of his spouse, protracted this conflict in such a manner that it continued for some time, though not very long. In the meanwhile our heavenly Lady suffered more spiritual torments and anxieties than all the saints together, for she gradually began to be alarmed by the fear of having lost God and fallen into disgrace on account of her own faults, and no one can estimate or know, except the Lord himself, what and how great was the grief of that burning heart, which had known how to love so much. To weigh this grief belongs to God alone, and in order that she might feel it in its fullest extent, she was left by God to overwhelming anxiety and fear of having lost him. Instruction which my Lady and Queen gave me. My daughter, all goods are estimated according to the appreciation in which creatures hold them, in so far as they value them, as they know them to be good. But since there is only one true good, and all the others merely fictitious and apparent, it follows that only the highest good is to be appreciated and recognized. Then only shalt thou give him true appreciation and love, when thou shalt enjoy and esteem him above all created things. By this appreciation and love will also be measured the sorrow of losing him, and from this thou canst understand something of my sentiments at the time when my eternal good God absented himself from me, leaving me in my fears lest perhaps I had lost him through my own fault. There is no doubt that many times the sorrows of this anxiety and the force of love would have deprived me of life if the Lord himself had not preserved it. Imagine, then, what ought to be the grief of losing God really by sin. If, without the bad effects of sin, the absence of our true good could cause such terrible suffering to the soul, knowing at the same time that it has not lost him, but still possesses him, though hidden and disguised to its present consciousness. But this wisdom seems far from the mind of carnal men. With a most perverse blindness they continue to make much of the visible and fictitious good, and they torment themselves and are disconsolate whenever it fails them, because they never taste or recognize the highest and truest good. They take no thought or reckoning of it. And although my most holy Son has brought a remedy for this dreadful ignorance contracted by the first sin, by meriting for men faith and charity, thereby affording them the possibility of knowing and experiencing to a certain extent the good which they never have experienced, yet, O sorrow, how easily charity is wasted and set aside for any kind of pleasure, and how often faith remains without any fruit and is involved in death. The sons of darkness live as if they had only a counterfeit or doubtful connection with eternity. Fear, my soul, this so slightly accounted danger. Rouse thyself and live always in watchfulness and preparation for the attacks of the enemies who never sleep. Let thy meditation day and night be how thou canst provide against losing the highest good which thou lovest. It is not befitting that thou sleep or slumber in the midst of invisible enemies. If sometimes thy beloved hides himself from thee, hope in patience and seek him solicitously without ceasing, since thou knowest not his secret judgments. For the time of his absence and temptation provide thyself with the oil of charity and good intention, so that it fail thee not in time of necessity, and that thou mayest not be rejected with the foolish and negligent virgins. Other afflictions of our Queen, some of which were permitted by the Lord through the agency of creatures and of the ancient serpent. The Most High continued to hide and conceal himself from the Princess of Heaven, and to this affliction, which was the most severe, his Majesty added others in order to increase her merit, her grace, and her reward, thus inflaming more and more the most pure love of the heavenly Lady. The great dragon and ancient serpent was not unwatchful of the heroic works of the Most Holy Mary, although he could not attain to the knowledge of her interior acts, since they were hidden from his view. Yet he scrutinized the exterior ones, which were so high and so perfect as to arouse the pride and indignation of that impious fiend, for the purity and the sanctity of the child Mary tormented him beyond all calculation. In his restless fury he called a conventicle of the infernal leaders in order to consult about the matter with the higher powers of hell. He addressed them as follows, quote, "The great triumph which we have until now obtained in the world by the possession of so many souls who are altogether subject to our wills is, I am afraid and anxious, about to be undone and counteracted by a woman. We cannot make light of such a danger, for we have been warned since our creation, and afterwards heard the sentence confirmed against us, that the woman shall crush our head, Genesis 3:15. Therefore we must be watchful and discard all carelessness. You have already been notified of a child who was born of Anne and is growing in age, and is at the same time distinguishing herself in virtue. I have paid careful attention to all her actions and movements, and I have not been able to discover in her the effects of the seeds of malice, which usually begin to show themselves at the dawn of reason, and at the beginning of the activity of the passions in the rest of the children of Adam. I have always seen her composed and most perfect, without being able to incline or induce her to fall into the slightest human imperfections, which are so natural in the other children. On this account I fear lest she be the one chosen as the mother of him who is to become man. Yet I cannot convince myself of this, for she was born as the rest of women, and subject to the common laws of nature. Her parents offered prayers and sacrifices in atonement for her and their own sins, and brought her to the temple just like other women. Even if she is not the one chosen as our enemy, her childhood points to great things, and her exquisite virtue and holiness gives promise of still greater things later on. Nor can I bear the prudence and discretion with which she acts in all her affairs. Her wisdom enrages me, her modesty irritates me, her humility annihilates me and oppresses me, and her whole behavior provokes me to unbearable wrath. I abhor her more than all the children of Adam. There is in her a special power which often makes it impossible for me to approach her. If I assail her with suggestions, she does not admit them, and all my efforts in her regard until this hour have been entirely fruitless. Hence it is important for us all that we find a remedy, and we must make the greatest exertions, lest our power be ruined. I desire the destruction of this soul more than that of all the world. Tell me, then, what means and what contrivances must we use in order to overcome her? I will certainly offer high and liberal rewards to anyone who shall accomplish her downfall." Unquote. The matter was ventilated in that confused synagogue. convoked solely for our ruin, and one of the chiefs of the horrible council said, quote, "Our chief and lord, do not allow thyself to be tormented by such a small matter, for a weak little maiden cannot be so invincible and powerful as all of us that follow thee. Thou hast deceived Eve, Genesis 3:4, dragging her down from the high position which she held, and through her didst also conquer her head, Adam. Then why shouldst thou not be able to overcome this woman, her descendant, who was born after the first fall? Promise thyself even at this moment such a victory, and in order to obtain it we will persist in tempting her, though she resist many times, and if necessary we will not stop at yielding some of our greatness and haughtiness, in the hope of finally deceiving her. If that does not suffice, we will try to destroy her honor or her life." Unquote. Other demons added their advice and said to Lucifer, quote, "By experience we know, O powerful chief, that to bring about the downfall of many souls, the most effective way is to make use of other creatures, and by their means we often succeed where we otherwise fail. Let us then plan and contrive the ruin of this woman in this way, first finding out the best time and the most favorable opportunity. Above all, it is necessary that we apply all our sagacity and astuteness to make her lose grace by some sin. As soon as this mainstay and bulwark of the just is lost to her, we can persecute and ensnare her in her forsakenness, and there will be no one to snatch her from our grasp, and we must exert ourselves to reduce her to despair of all remedy." Unquote. Lucifer expressed his thanks for these encouraging counsels of his followers and cooperators in crime. He commanded and exhorted the most astute in malice among them to accompany him as leader in this arduous enterprise, for he did not wish to trust it to the other hands. Although the demons assisted him, Lucifer himself in person was always at the force in tempting Mary and her most holy Son in the desert, as well as during the whole course of their lives, as we shall see later on. In the meanwhile, our heavenly princess continued to sigh and grieve over the absence of her beloved, and thus the infernal squadron found her when they rushed forward to begin their temptations. But the divine power, which overshadowed her, hindered the assaults of Lucifer, so that he could not approach very closely to her, nor could he execute all that he had intended. By permission of God, the hellish host excited in her faculties many suggestions and various thoughts of highest iniquity and malice, for the Lord did not judge it to be alien to the Mother of Grace, that she should be tempted in all things, although she was to be without sin in temptation, as was afterwards her most holy Son. It cannot easily be conceived how much in this new conflict the most pure and innocent heart of Mary suffered, seeing herself assailed by suggestions so foreign and so distant from the ineffable purity and nobility of her heavenly mind. When the ancient serpent perceived the affliction and tears of the great lady, he imagined that he had on this account more power over her, being blinded by his own pride and not knowing the secrets of heaven. Therefore, animating his infernal helpers, he said to them, quote, "Let us persecute her now. Let us persecute her. Already it seems we are gaining our end, for she feels sorrowful, which is an opening for discouragement." Unquote. In this mistaken conviction, they suggested new thoughts of dejection and despair, and they assailed her with terrible imaginations, but in vain, for as this flawless stone was struck by occasions of more exalted virtues, so also it gave forth more generously the sparks and flames of divine love. Our invincible queen was so superior to this infernal battery that her interior showed no signs of change, nor even of an understanding of such terrible suggestions, except in so far as to concentrate ourselves the more in the exercise of her incomparable virtues, and allow the flames of divine love which burned in her breast to ascend so much the higher. The dragon, though seeing her courage and constancy, and though feeling the force of the divine assistance, knew nothing of the hidden wisdom and prudence of our sovereign queen. Nevertheless, he persisted in his pride and besieged the city of God in diverse ways and in several kinds of warfare. The astute enemy during this warfare often changed his engines of war, but his machinery was like the sting of a weak hornet against a diamond or adamantine wall. Our princess was that strong woman, Proverbs 31:11, on whom the heart of her husband confidently relied, without the least anxiety lest his desires should be frustrated in her. Her adornments were fortitude, Proverbs 31:25, which filled her with beauty, and her vestments were purity and charity, which served her as a helmet. The unclean and proud serpent could not look upon this creature without being blinded anew in the fury of his confusion. Therefore he resolved to take away her life, and the horde of malignant spirits began to exert their utmost powers toward this end. In this attempt they spent some time, but with just as little success. The knowledge of this hidden mystery caused in me great wonder, especially when I considered the extremes to which the fury of Lucifer was allowed to proceed against the Most Holy Mary in her tender years, and when I beheld the hidden and vigilant defense and protection of the Most High. I saw how attentive the Lord was toward his chosen, and only one among creatures, and I saw at the same time all hell lashed into fury against her, and exerting against her in fullest indignation such a wrath as had never till then been exerted against any other creature, and I saw the facility with which God neutralizes the infernal power and astuteness. O more than unhappy Lucifer, how much greater is thy pride and arrogance than thy strength! Isaiah 16:6. Very weak and helpless art thou, in spite of thy high-flown pretensions. Begin to confide less in thyself, and expect no such great triumphs, for a tender child crushes thy head and sends thee back conquered in all things and altogether vanquished. Acknowledge now that thou canst not do and knowest but little, since thou wast even ignorant of the sacrament of the King. Acknowledge that his power has humiliated thee by the instrument thou hadst despised, by a feeble woman, by a child in its natural weakness. Oh, how evident would thy ignorance also become in regard to men, if they would avail themselves of the protection of the Most High, and of the example, the imitation, and the intercession of that victorious and triumphant mistress of angels and men. During these varying temptations and combats, the fervent prayers of Most Holy Mary never ceased, and she spoke to the Lord, quote, Now, O my most high God, while I am in tribulation, be with me. Psalm 90:15. Now that I call to thee with my whole heart and seek thy justification. Psalm 118:14. Let my prayers come to thy ears. Now that I suffer such violence, wilt thou answer me? Isaiah 38:14. Thou, my Lord and Father, be my strength and my refuge. Psalm 30, the number 30 and the number 4. And because of thy holy name, thou wilt deliver me from danger. Thou wilt lead me the sure way and nourish me as thy daughter. Unquote. She repeated also many mysteries of the Holy Scriptures, especially passages from the Psalms, to invoke his aid against the invisible enemies. With these invincible arms, losing not an atom of interior peace, equanimity, and resignation, but rather confirming herself more therein, she raised her spirit on high, battled with, resisted, and conquered Satan, to the inexpressible delight of the Lord, and for her great merit. After the Most Holy Virgin had successfully fought these secret temptations and battles, the serpent instituted a new conflict by means of creatures. For this purpose he secretly kindled the sparks of envy and emulation against the Most Holy Mary in the hearts of her maiden companions of the temple. This contagion was much the harder to counteract, as it arose from the punctuality with which our heavenly princess distinguished herself in the practice of all virtues, growing in wisdom and grace before God and man. For where the prodding of ambition is, the very light of virtue darkens and blinds the judgment, and at last enkindles the flames of envy. The dragon, through his secret suggestions, persuaded these simple maidens that the light of this sun, Most Holy Mary, would obscure them and cause them to be little noticed, that on her account their own negligences were more clearly apparent to the priests than their teacher, and that Mary alone was preferred in the estimation and judgment of all. The companions of our Queen allowed the devil to sow this bad seed in their bosoms, for they were heedless and little experienced in spiritual ways. They allowed it to increase until it grew into a sort of interior abhorrence of the most pure Mary, and into anger. Filled with this anger, they began to look upon and treat her with hatred, not being able to endure the modesty of that most innocent dove. For the dragon had incited them, and had already imbued the incautious girls with some of his own wrath. The temptation continuing, its effects became manifest, and the temple maidens began to plot among themselves, ignorant of the spirit that moved them. They agreed among themselves to molest and persecute the unknown princess of the world until she should be forced to leave the temple. Accordingly, they called her aside and spoke to her very sharp words, treating her at the same time very haughtily. They called her a hypocrite and reproached her with scheming to obtain the favor of the priests and of their teacher, while seeking to discredit all the other girls by her complaints and her exaggerations of their faults, whereas she was the most useless of them all and therefore deserved their hatred as an enemy. That didn't make much sense. Let's see. Oh, that's what it says. Okay. These, I don't know this word, these contumelies, and many other accusations, the most prudent virgin bore without disturbance and most with equable humility. She answered, quote, "My friends and my mistresses, you are right, no doubt, in saying that I am the least and the most imperfect among you. But then you, my sisters, being better informed, must pardon me my faults, and must teach me in my ignorance. Direct me, therefore, that I may succeed in doing better, and act according to your pleasure. I beseech you, my friends, not to deny me your good will, which, though I am so imperfect, I sincerely wish to merit. For I love you, and reverence you as a servant, and I will obey you in all things in which you desire to make a trial of my good will. Command me then, and tell me what you wish of me." Unquote. These humble and sweet reasonings of the most humble Mary did not soften the hardened hearts of her associates and companions, for they were infected by the poisonous fury of the dragon against her. Precisely on account of her sweet humility, he became so much the more infuriated, and thus turned this sweet antidote against the poisonous bite into a means of inflaming them with open wrath against her, who was the great sign in heaven. Apocalypse 12:15. For many days this persecution continued, during which the heavenly lady sought in vain to appease the hate of her companions by her humility, patience, modesty, and tolerance. On the contrary, the demon was emboldened to inspire them with many thoughts full of temerity, urging them to lay violent hands on the most humble lamb and maltreat her, even so far as to take away her life. But the Lord did not permit the execution of such sacrilegious suggestions, and the farthest which they were allowed to proceed was to insult her by words or to inflict some blows. This quarreling remained concealed from the teacher of the maidens and from the priests, and during this time Most Holy Mary gained incomparable merits in the sight of the Almighty, because she took occasion to exercise all the virtues, as well in regard to God as also in regard to the creatures, which were persecuting and hating her. She performed heroic acts of charity and humility, yielding good for evil, blessings for curses, prayers for blasphemies, 1 Corinthians 4:13, fulfilling in all things the most perfect and the highest requirements of the divine law. Before the Lord she exercised the most exalted virtues by praying for his creatures who were persecuting her, and she excited the admiration of the angels by humiliating herself as if she were the vilest of mortals, deservedly treated in that way. In all these things she surpassed the conceptions of men in the highest merits of the seraphim. It happened one day that, impelled by the diabolical suggestions, these girls brought Mary to a retired room where they could act with more safety. Here they began to heap unmeasured injuries and insults upon her, in order to excite her to weakness or anger, and to entrap her imperturbable modesty into some hasty action. But as the Queen of Virtues could not even for a moment be subject to vice, she showed herself immovable, and she answered them with great kindness and sweetness. Being enraged beyond bounds on account of not succeeding in their purpose, her companions raised their voices in discordant strife, so that they were heard in the temple, and by such unwonted noise caused great astonishment and confusion. The priest and the teacher hastened to the place where the noise proceeded, and the Lord permitted a new humiliation of his spouse, for they asked with severity what was the cause of this strife. While the most meek dove remained silent, the other maidens angrily answered and said, quote, "Mary of Nazareth brings us all into strife and quarreling by her horrid conduct. For in your absence she irritates and provokes us in such a manner that if she does not leave the temple, it will be impossible to keep any peace with her. When we allow her her own way, she becomes overbearing. If we reprehend her, she makes fun of all of us by prostrating herself at our feet with feigned humility, and afterwards she quarrels anew and throws all into uproar." Unquote. The priests and the instructresses brought the mistress of the world into another room, and there they severely reprehended her, giving full credit at that time to all the accusations of her companions, and having exhorted her to reform and behave as one living in the house of God. They threatened to expel her from the temple if she would not mend her conduct. This threat was the most severe punishment which they could have given her, even if she had been guilty. So much the more severe was it when she was altogether innocent of any of the faults imputed to her. Whoever will obtain from the Lord some understanding of a part only of the profound humility of the Most Holy Mary will also understand somewhat of the effects of these mysteries in her most innocent heart, for she judged herself to be the most vile of the women born, and most unworthy to live among them, and to burden the earth with her presence. This threat cruelly lacerated the heart of the most prudent virgin, and in tears she answered and said to the priests, quote, "My masters, I acknowledge the favor which you do me in correcting and teaching me, the most imperfect and despicable of creatures. But I beseech you, pardon me, you who are the servants of the Most High, and overlooking my defects, direct me in all things so that I may reform, and from now on to give pleasure to His Majesty and to my sisters and companions. From now on, give pleasure to His Majesty and to my sisters and companions. With the grace of the Lord, I will resolve this anew, and will commence from today." Unquote. Our queen added other words full of sweetest innocence and modesty, and therewith the instructress and the priests dismissed her, enjoining anew upon her that doctrine of which she herself was the most wise teacher. Immediately she betook herself to her companions, and prostrating herself at their feet, she asked them pardon, as if the faults with which they had charged her could ever have been shared by the mother of all innocence. They received her this time with more goodwill, because they thought that her tears were the effect of the punishment and the warning of the priests and the instructress, whom they had induced to act thus in pursuance of their badly governed passions. The dragon, who was secretly contriving this entanglement, urged the incautious hearts of all these girls to still greater haughtiness and presumption, and as they had now made headway in the estimation of the priests themselves, they proceeded to greater audacity in discrediting and lowering the good name of the most pure Virgin. Accordingly, by instigation of the devil, they fabricated new accusations and lies, but the Most High never permitted them to say anything very grave and dishonorable of her, whom He had chosen as the most holy mother of His only begotten. He merely allowed the indignation and deceit of the maidens to go so far as to exaggerate very much some small faults, which were even in themselves altogether fictitious, but which they accused her of. Moreover, they were permitted to practice many feminine intrigues, to which their own restlessness drove them. In these different ways, and in the reprehensions of her instructress and of the priests, our most humble Lady Mary found many occasions of exercising virtues, of increasing the gifts of the Most High, and of exalting her merit. In all this our Queen acted with the plenitude of perfection in the eyes of the Lord, who regaled Himself with the sweetest odor of that humble spikenard. Canticles 1:18. Maltreated and despised by the creatures who did not know her, she repeated and continued her clamors and her sighs on account of the absence of her beloved. And on one of these occasions she said, quote, "My highest good and Lord of infinite mercies, if Thou, who art my Lord and my Maker, hast forsaken me, it is not strange that all the creatures abhor me and rise up against me. All this my ingratitude to Thy benefits well merits. Nevertheless, I will always acknowledge and confess Thee as my refuge and my treasure. Thou alone art my God, my beloved, and my rest. If then Thou art this to me, how can my afflicted heart come to rest? The creatures do only that with me which they should, but they do not go so far in this as I merit, because Thou, O my Lord and Father, in punishing art so sparing, and in rewarding art so generous. Discount, O Lord, my negligences by my sorrow of having lost Thy interior presence, and pay back with a liberal hand the benefits, blessings which Thy creatures gain for me in forcing me to acknowledge Thy goodness and my meanness. Raise, O Lord, the needy one from the dust of the earth, and renew her who is poor and the most abject of the creatures. And then May I see thy divine face and be saved. Unquote. Psalm 79:5. I'll read one more stanza. Well, I'll go ahead and finish this because it's almost done. It would not be possible, nor is it necessary, to relate all that happened to our Queen in this test of her virtues, but leaving her at present therein, and considering her behavior, we will have in her a living example, teaching us to bear with exultation all the troubles, pains, and strifes which are so necessary in order to satisfy for our sins and subject our necks to the yoke of mortification. There was no sin nor any deceit in our most innocent dove, yet in humble silence and patience she suffered ungrounded hate and persecution. Let us then be confounded in her presence, that we should deem slight injuries irreparable offenses which must be avenged, whereas all offenses, of whatever kind, are to be held but slight by those who have God for their enemy. The Most High was mighty to preserve her from all persecution, but then he could not have shown his power in lending her out of it unharmed, nor would he have given her such dear pledges of his love, nor would she have reaped the sweet fruit of loving her enemies and her persecutors. We make ourselves unworthy of such great blessings in raising an outcry against creatures whenever that we are injured, and our proud heart rises up against God himself, who arranges all things, for it refuses to subject itself to its Creator and Justifier, who knows what is necessary for our salvation. Instruction of the Queen of Heaven, most blessed Mary. Take notice then, my daughter, that the example of the